As the sun's rays slithered through the window, their cold light slowly pooling over me, I woke with a jolt, an uneasy weight already pressing on my chest. I knew I was late. That gut-wrenching sensation, that clawing sense that something was horribly wrong, it was unmistakable. My wife used to set the alarm for me every morning, but she wasn't there now, hadn't been for a while. The task had slipped my mind again, like it often does these days. Now I was sleeping alone. When I'm late, my daughters are late too. I'm their alarm, their clock. I've told them 1,000 times to set their own, but they never listen. When my system fails, there's crumbles too. I stumbled into their rooms, shaking them, hollering, trying to snap them from their slumber like pulling someone from deep water. Their sleepy faces twisted into sleepy grins as I barked that there'd be no time for breakfast. "Just get in the car," I growled, shoving them out the door. Abi, my eldest, flinched when I kissed her forehead. Her face contorted, almost in pain, as if my touch burned. She rubbed at the spot, her eyes distant, like something was wrong. Lucy, my youngest, smiled her bright, innocent smile. "I love you, Daddy," she chirped. But there was something in her voice that chilled me. I dropped them off, watching them vanish into the school's looming halls. The silence in the car felt heavier than before, like something dark had slipped in with me. At my own school, I parked and rushed inside, almost colliding with John in the hallway. He gave me that same disapproving shake of the head, checking his watch for confirmation late again. He didn't even bother to speak this time. His sympathy had run dry. Then it began. The stares of 30 pairs of eyes, piercing, hollow. I could feel the weight of my hangover like a noose around my neck. "Good morning, class," I muttered, my voice rasping. They responded, but their voices seemed distant, fading. Mondays were always the worst. Feedback day. The day I'd have to face her, Sophie. My stomach twisted as I anticipated her story. Another disturbing chapter, no doubt, scrawled in that looping, uneven handwriting of hers. She always handed in her stories with this strange, eager smile, though I could never shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Cordelia and Ophelia, her princesses, had started as mere troublemakers in a decrepit castle, but the stories had grown darker, more twisted. And then, there was the Obsidian man. He haunted the pages, never described, just a presence. He appeared in places he shouldn't be, standing by Ophelia's bed when Cordelia left for town, lurking in the forest, watching. "Who is he?" I asked her once, trying to keep my voice steady. She only shrugged, her eyes unnervingly blank. "He's just there," she said. "I don't know." Each new story, he crept closer, his shadow stretching longer, deeper, darker. And then, last Friday, she handed me the one I had dreaded the most. The Obsidian man finally stepped forward. I shuddered, feeling the same chill that had been growing inside me since that morning. I wasn't sure anymore where the stories ended and my life began. The Obsidian man had started whispering to Princess Cordelia, his voice slithering into her thoughts like venom. At first, she tried to ignore it, shaking her head, covering her ears. But no matter what she did, that voice so deep, so low, it felt like it was rumbling from the depths of her own stomach, was always there. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, vibrating through her bones, twisting her insides. "I don't want to listen, but I have to," Cordelia confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "It must belong to a god." That's when I noticed Sophie. Her face had become pale, almost ghostly, her eyes darkening as if something was draining the life from her. She stopped talking in class, and when she did, it often ended in fits of tears, uncontrollable sobbing that chilled the room. Her hair hung in wild, tangled knots, and her once pristine uniform grew disheveled and stained. She was unraveling before my eyes. Eventually, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I told John, and together we called her father, Mr. Sterling. He agreed to meet with us one Friday afternoon in my classroom. As I voiced my concerns, how Sophie's story seemed to mirror a deeper struggle, I saw the weariness in Mr. Sterling's eyes. He explained that Sophie and her younger sister Monica had withdrawn from everyone after his separation from their mother. He too had noticed the changes but felt helpless, juggling 2 jobs and 2 kids. John suggested that maybe Sophie was using her stories as a form of coping, perhaps as Cordelia, with her sister Ophelia representing Monica, and the Obsidian Man embodying the dark cloud of the divorce, a haunting presence that Sophie couldn't escape. Mr. Sterling agreed, even seemed relieved by the idea, but I wasn't convinced. I showed him copies of her stories, and he grew defensive. Sophie would never steal. He snapped when I pointed out how the Obsidian Man had convinced Cordelia to steal from the marketplace, to take what wasn't hers. But the stories were growing darker. The king in Sophie's tales was always absent, off fighting battles or getting drunk at lavish feasts, while the Obsidian Man whispered terrible things into Cordelia's ear. He commanded her to do unspeakable things to her sister. She would force Ophelia to drink spoiled milk until she vomited, drive tacks into her legs, and even hold her head under water until she came up gasping and sobbing, just to make the whispers stop. Cordelia hated it, wanted to resist, but she couldn't. The Obsidian Man was like a puppeteer, pulling her strings while the king, oblivious, uncaring, remained in the background. Each story ended with Cordelia crafting grotesque gifts for the Obsidian Man, jewelry made from broken glass and torn paper, while his shadow loomed over her, always watching, never seen. My concern grew for Sophie's little sister, Monica. She wasn't in my class, but I asked John to look into it, to ensure nothing sinister was happening between the sisters. John spoke to Mr. Sterling again, but the man was clueless. I haven't noticed anything unusual, he insisted. But I wasn't surprised the king never noticed in Sophie's stories either. Reading Sophie's stories became a kind of torture for me. Every Friday, I would sit at my desk, holding my breath as I turned the pages, dreading the horrors I knew were waiting for me. The Obsidian Man wasn't just haunting Cordelia anymore, he was haunting me too. Then, one Friday in October, I received Sophie's final story. It was titled The Obsidian Man Steps Back. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the moment Sophie would overcome her darkness, finally free Cordelia from the grip of the Obsidian Man. But I couldn't have been more wrong. In the story, Cordelia had begun sneaking jugs of oil into the castle, stolen from the townspeople, all at the Obsidian Man's bidding. The king, distracted by his endless wars, noticed nothing. She hid the oil in the dungeons, waiting. And then, on a day when the king rode off to battle once again, Cordelia struck a match. The story ended there. But I knew what it meant. The fire, the destruction. And the Obsidian Man, who had always been watching from the shadows, finally stepped back, his work complete. I put down the story, my hands trembling. I wasn't sure anymore if this was just fiction, or if Sophie was telling me something far, far worse. The Obsidian Man's voice slithered through Cordelia's mind, urging her to douse the castle in oil, to pour it thickly around Ophelia's room, encircling the doors and windows. "It must cleanse this place," he hissed. "You are such a good girl." Sophie wrote of Cordelia standing outside the castle, a flaming torch gripped in her trembling hand. A slick line of flammable oil beckoned, glistening in the dim light, a sinister path leading to the heart of the castle, waiting to be ignited. The Obsidian Man placed an icy hand on her shoulder, the chills sinking into her flesh. For the first time, she felt his touch terrifying yet oddly reassuring. This was right. She was meant to do this. He leaned closer, his breath cold against her neck, whispering secrets that twisted her thoughts into knots. I dropped the pages in horror, unable to read another word. My hands shook as I dialed John, recounting the dreadful tale. He promised to speak to Sophie first thing Monday morning, but as I hung up, I poured myself a generous glass of whiskey, the amber liquid a desperate balm for my nerves after reading Sophie's last story. The next morning, I awoke slumped in my chair, the hum of my phone pulling me from a restless stupor. John's voice crackled over the line, tense and urgent. He told me that townspeople had reported their cars siphoned of gas overnight, some claiming they'd seen a young girl with canisters. The police had reviewed security footage from the local schools, and I felt a chill settle in my bones. I just knew it was Sophie. Get down here, he urged, his voice low and serious. I hesitated, my empathy for Mr. Sterling at war with my concern for Sophie. Instead of heading to the police station, I drove to their house. Mr. Sterling answered the door, disbelief etched across his face as I explained the situation. At first, he denied Sophie's involvement, but eventually, he admitted he'd been working the night shift and couldn't account for her whereabouts. Just then, she appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of horror, a young girl stumbling into her living room on a Saturday morning to find her English teacher waiting. When I questioned her about the cars, she denied it softly at first, but as I pressed harder, her demeanor shifted. Her voice grew more aggressive. You're not in trouble, sweetheart. We just want to help. I don't know, she cried, her head snapping up, eyes wild. Go home, leave, just go home. Her voice warped, the words dripping with rage as her eyes rolled back into her skull. Suddenly, she began pounding her fists against the wall, her legs flailing as if possessed. Mr. Sterling leaped to his feet, fear etched across his face, and grabbed his daughter just as she collapsed to the floor, shaking violently. He's here, he's in the room, she gasped, her voice cracking. I can hear him whispering, don't listen to him, Cordelia. Quick, hand me that syringe. He barked at me, his tone urgent yet oddly calm. I complied, my heart racing as I watched him inject a clear liquid into Sophie's arm. The ease with which he did it suggested this wasn't the first time. This was routine for them. Foam began to gather at the corners of Sophie's mouth as her body shook violently one last time before she finally relaxed, her muscles releasing their tension. My heart ached as she came to, sobbing in her father's embrace. He held her tightly, his stoic expression betraying nothing of the turmoil inside. I think you should leave now, he said to me, his voice cold and dismissive. What the hell was that? I asked, bewildered. Please leave us alone. His tone brooked no argument. As I stumbled out of their home, my hands trembled, a cold sweat coating my skin. I hadn't been prepared for this. The walk home felt like a fever dream. I found myself at the corner shop, the siren call of a bottle of something strong whispering to me. You okay, Mr. Smith? Andy asked from behind the counter as I walked in, concern etched in his expression. Yeah, I mumbled, my face pale. I fished my wallet from my pocket, grabbing a couple of packets of M&Ms from the shelf and tossing them onto the counter. Andy placed my usual bottle before me, leaning in closer. I wasn't going to say anything, but is everything okay with you? He asked, lowering his voice. What do you mean? I replied, puzzled. He hesitated, then said, I caught a kid shoplifting here last week. You know my Abby, right? Well, I saw her pack some fish fingers into her backpack when she thought I wasn't looking. Most kids try to lift sweets or booze, but... His voice trailed off, leaving a heavy silence hanging between us, ... But I was lost in my thoughts, the shadows of the Sterling household still creeping through my mind. That's when I remembered the fishmonger, his anger boiling over as he yanked poor Cordelia by her coat, her pained yelp echoing in my ears as she turned to face him. What was happening to them? To Sophie? To Cordelia? As I stumbled out of the shop, the weight of it all pressed down on me, the darkness lurking ever closer. He released her the moment she recognized the princess's face, his heart plummeting as the truth settled in. He had finally seized the king's eldest daughter. Sophie had written, I never ran as fast as I did to get home, and I doubt I'll ever run faster again. By the time I reached the house, flames clawed at every window, the roof sagging like a wounded beast, ready to collapse under the weight of its own fury. I stood there, numb with shock, as fiery blasts erupted from Lucy's room. The fire was more ferocious there, a hungry beast consuming everything in its path, and the acrid stench of charred flesh filled the air. In the back garden, Abby sat, blissfully unaware of the devastation around her, kicking her feet as she wove delicate daisy chains. A line of scorched grass marked her path from the house to her makeshift haven, the contrast of her innocence against the backdrop of chaos stark and haunting. She tied knots in the flowers, humming a soft tune, her face a mask of concentration, as if the world around her had melted away. I sat beside her, a silent witness to my own destruction, my heart racing as the roof of our home crumbled, sending embers spiraling into the night. The heat of the inferno licked at my skin, a fiery kiss reminding me I was still alive. Yet I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, desperately hoping to wake up. Once she finished her chains, Abby tied one around her wrist, the delicate flowers a stark contrast to the devastation surrounding us. She held another in her right hand, her eyes sparkling with innocence. "Is that for me?" I croaked, my throat thick with dread, pointing to the garland she clutched so tightly. "No," she replied, her voice calm and unwavering. "It's for Lucy." A chill coursed through me as I realized Abby was offering something far more sinister than a simple flower chain. She was tying the very essence of her sister to the flames, as if it were a gift to the inferno that threatened to swallow us whole.